In the silent white expanse of Alaska's frozen frontier, what began as a geopolitical chess move became the prelude to one of humanity's most brutal conflicts, and the story of the Battle of Anchorage starts long before the first snow-covered trenches, or mechanized cavalry, clashed in the Arctic twilight. By the mid-21st century, the world had slipped into a relentlessly shrinking cycle of resource wars, and the United States and the People's Republic of China found themselves locked in an escalating spiral of strategic desperation. For the US, the vast Alaskan wilderness represented not only the last great frontier of domestic security, but a vital bulwark against a hemispheric adversary. For China, the frigid landmass biting into the Pacific stood as both a foothold into North America and a repository of energy reserves that might prolong its survival in a world running out of fuel. According to official US records, the winter of 2066 marked the invasion by the Chinese army across the Bering Strait and into Alaska's oil fields and pipelines. And while the exact moment of first shot fired remains classified, law and loading screen hints confirm that the Chinese forces seized sections of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the Northern Wilds in what would become known as the Anchorage Front. In Washington and Beijing alike, the war was treated as both existential and inevitable, yet public narratives obfuscated the true motive. It was never merely about territory, but about the last flickering embers of industrial civilization. While headlines spoke of liberation and defense of freedom, behind the scenes both superpowers kept their eyes fixed on the black gold buried beneath permafrost, and the strategic advantage of controlling only accessible reserves left on the planet. America's response was swift, but hampered by ambition and scarcity. Troops were dispatched to Alaska under the command of generals whose names would later be lionized in hollow memories, but they faced terrain, climate, and supply lines few had anticipated. The frozen tundra became a theater of war, where the quiet hiss of static-charged snowstorms masked the arrival of armored columns, and where every ridge and ice-rimmed valley could conceal the enemy's stealth infiltrators. The U.S., mobilized across its northern territories and into Canadian corridors, establishing forward supply nodes and railheads to compensate for airdrop vulnerabilities, but the decision to penetrate Canadian sovereignty in aid of trans-Alaskan logistics became a political firestorm of its own. On the Chinese side, the invasion into Alaska represented the outward thrust of a military-industrial juggernaut that had sensed its moment. Fleets of amphibious assault vessels, sleeper agents, embedded in pipeline infrastructure, and the most advanced stealth infantry available to the PLA rolled into the frozen north with a calculated audacity. Yet even as the conflict raged quietly below the Arctic Circle, both capitals treated it with a mix of urgency and cynicism. Engineers in California and Shandong worked on fusion cores and walking tanks. Politicians issued public statements about defending our way of life, and corporations quietly increased war-related contracts in a world teetering on the edge of collapse. As the first months of the campaign unfolded, Alaska's climate proved as much an enemy as any rifle-wielding soldier. Collapsed supply convoys, storms that stripped camouflage off bunkers, and bitter frostbite casualties that outnumbered initial combat deaths forced American commanders to recalibrate. The terrain offered long, silent approaches across White Plains, but once the lines hardened, it turned into trench warfare in tundra, an environment neither enemy had fought in at scale before. In the first year, U.S. forces held a defensive position, nominating Anchorage itself as a bulwark, while China extended its reach further south, attempting to seize key oil nodes and glacier-fed reservoirs. The Americans, constrained by fuel scarcity and public pressure, began to deploy their first experiments in power armor technology. The early T-45 suits built by West Tech and marketed in military briefings as walking tanks. These suits, praised in propaganda, in fact suffered from fatal flaws. Engineers internally admitted the designs were rushed, energy cell consumption was high, and joints cracked in freezing temperatures. But still, the sight of a single power-armored infantryman cutting through enemy lines became iconic, the spark of hope in a war that many believed they might lose. On the home front, Washington quietly shifted into a total war economy. Propaganda reels painted Alaska as the thin red line, protecting the mainland. Nuka-Cola Victory flavor was launched, and corporations like Voltec and Westtech expanded their war contracts under the guise of national necessity. The American public, fatigued by decades of crises, accepted the campaign as just another frontline battle, not realizing that each convoy across the Yukon corridor was an act of logistical desperation, and every pipeline blown up in Anchorage's shadow was another strike at a fragile industrial civilization. Meanwhile, in Canada, resentment simmered as rail and truck convoys traversed Canadian terrain, and by 2072, the U.S. annexation of large portions of Canada under the pretext of military necessity to support the Alaskan theater had begun, a fact barely mentioned in archived broadcasts. Yet even as flags were planted and supply lines reinforced, the deeper truth shimmered beneath the surface. Alaska was not the endgame. It was the crucible. Behind the public celebrations of liberating Anchorage lurked documents marked Top Secret for official use only, which warned that America's victory would not secure peace, that the world's stockpile of fossil energy was collapsing, and that the campaign served the dual purpose of testing new weapon systems and social resilience in a nation hurtling toward collapse. In an icy mist of truth and propaganda, the war to defend the frontier became the war to salvage a civilization already dying, and the frozen battlefields of Anchorage would become a template for the apocalypse to come. And so, the world turned its gaze northward, not with hope, but with dread. The pillars of the old order, the oil drilling platforms off the coast of Alaska, the pipelines snaking beneath the permafrost, the power-armored walkers trudging over snow and ruin, all carried with them the dying breath of an era. In the glare of searchlights and exploding shells, men and machines stormed the ice, believing they marched toward victory, unaware they marched toward an end. In the hush between shellfire and wind, the frozen beginning became the first chapter of humanity's final war. The war for the North was never a single campaign, but a slow suffocation that gripped the world's last frontier and refused to let go. When Chinese forces first entrenched themselves across the frozen plains of Alaska, the United States still believed it could win the conflict through superior industry and automation. It was a lie wrapped in hope. America had already begun to hollow out from within, its economy drained by decades of resource wars, and its citizens bound to ration cards and recycled promises. But the myth of technological supremacy endured like a religion. The Chinese incursion had cut deep into the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, choking the nation's final lifeline to oil, and what began as a border dispute mutated into an existential crisis for both nations. The White House declared that Alaska would be liberated at any cost, but what few knew then was that the machinery of war had grown hungrier than the country it served. The military-industrial complex no longer obeyed the civilians who funded it. Instead, corporations like Robco, General Atomics, and West Tech drove the rhythm of the conflict, introducing automated drones, experimental armor, and new forms of power-assisted infantry. For every advance, however, came a price. Automation replaced manpower, and veterans returning home found themselves unemployed, unneeded, and forgotten. Meanwhile, those deployed to Anchorage called themselves the Frozen Few, men and women who learned that the cold was not their greatest enemy, but the endless grind of attrition that erased both identity and mercy. The geography of the Northern Front was cruel beyond imagination. Across mountains crusted with permafrost, platoons moved through fog and magnetic storms that played havoc with communications and sensors. Chinese stealth teams slipped past radar nets, wearing adaptive camouflage that made them ghosts in the snow. American commanders adapted by constructing vast trench networks lined with thermally insulated shelters and powered by portable fusion cells, each node connected to a fragile web of supply lines stretching from annexed Canadian territories to the coastal ports of Anchorage. Convoys wound their way through mountain passes under constant threat of ambush or sabotage, and any vehicle that stalled risked freezing solid in hours. Entire regiments vanished in blizzards, their last transmissions reduced to static. For those who survived, every sunrise brought not victory, but survival, measured in hours. Anchorage itself transformed from a civilian city into a fortress state, an industrial hub churning out weapons, rations, and propaganda alike. The local population had either fled or been conscripted, and the few remaining civilians became extensions of the war machine, forced to build and repair what the conflict consumed each night. The Chinese occupation of Alaska relied on momentum, but their logistics were even more fragile than America's. Supply fleets had to traverse the perilous Bering Strait, often under fire from American submarines and vertibird patrols. When the winter storms closed in, even satellites lost track of positions. The war froze, literally and metaphorically, into a stalemate. Each side claimed victories that never existed, and each broadcast hollow triumphs to maintain morale back home. But beneath the veneer of patriotic slogans, commanders knew the truth. This was a war of exhaustion, and whoever ran out of resources first would collapse. To counteract the deadlock, America unleashed its next experiment: cybernetic command integration. Field officers received neural-linked targeting systems, combat AI coordination, and prototype Pip-Boys that relayed real-time telemetry to higher command. The result was a paradoxical blend of precision and chaos. Soldiers became nodes in a network that promised efficiency but stripped individuality. Mistakes were punished by automated court-martials, while acts of heroism vanished in the data stream. The soldiers fought not only an enemy they could rarely see, but a system that judged them through numbers and metrics. For the Chinese, the war's moral weight was equally corrosive. Their propaganda framed the invasion as a preemptive strike against Western exploitation, a crusade to seize the resources that had once been hoarded by the decadent powers of the past century. Yet, as their soldiers froze on foreign soil, disillusionment spread. Reports smuggled out of the front lines told of units starving in makeshift camps, of officers executing deserters, and of espionage operations targeting America's own defense networks to prolong the stalemate. The People's Liberation Army's superior stealth technology, initially a decisive edge, began to fail as American engineers learned to tune power armor sensors to detect shifts in ambient temperature and electromagnetic fields. Each breakthrough, however, only deepened the blood debt of progress. The battlefield had become a laboratory, and soldiers its unwilling specimens. As the years crawled on, the war for the North ceased to resemble a conventional conflict. It became a grinding machine that consumed generations of men, metal, and morality. Soldiers wrote home about skies lit with auroras that danced above ruined cities, and how the light of nature mocked the artificial glow of their muzzle flashes. American news broadcasts spoke of victories in the liberation zones, but entire divisions were being wiped out in silence. The government quietly expanded the draft, drawing in younger recruits from across the continental United States. By 2072, conscription had extended to civilians working in strategic industries, forcing even scientists and technicians to the front. At the same time, the occupation of Canada had escalated into a military dictatorship. As riots broke out against American control, Canada's cities became staging grounds for the Alaskan campaign, but also prisons for dissent. The War for the North was no longer a clash between nations. It had become a contagion, spreading its authoritarian fever wherever it touched. The Northern Front also birthed a new breed of weaponry that would forever change human conflict. The early power armor suits, clumsy and fragile in Anchorage's cold, gave way to the T-51B, the culmination of West Tech's relentless innovation and moral blindness. The T-51B was more than armor. It was a symbol of the new soldier, one who no longer depended on flesh but on fusion. Power-armored troops began to march across the tundra in coordinated assaults, impervious to small arms fire and capable of carrying weapons that once required vehicle platforms. They called them the Iron Men of Anchorage, and propaganda posters depicted them as the saviors of the Republic. Yet, inside the sealed suits, soldiers suffocated in isolation, their own body heat recycled through climate systems that sometimes failed, freezing them to death in silence. It was said that when a power armor unit fell in battle, recovery crews often found the pilot's face contorted in terror rather than pain, a testament to the psychological toll of fighting encased in metal. By the mid-2070s, the war for the North had expanded far beyond the icy frontier. The United States had militarized its society to sustain the conflict. Food production shifted to synthetic protein vats, civilian manufacturing to weapons, and propaganda to full-time indoctrination. Every school, workplace, and broadcast repeated the same message: Anchorage must be liberated. The phrase became a mantra, an unbreakable justification for every loss and every atrocity. Chinese broadcasts mirrored the same rhetoric, declaring Alaska to be China's rightful resource inheritance. The truth was that neither side could stop. The war had grown too big to end, and too costly to continue. Each new offensive devoured more lives for fewer gains, and as the front lines froze in place, whispers of nuclear escalation began to surface within military circles. Washington's secret laboratories accelerated research into directed energy weapons, orbital bombardment systems, and experimental viruses, early precursors to the forced evolutionary virus that would later scar humanity beyond recognition. The line between defense and annihilation blurred with every passing winter. In the closing phase of the War for the North, the landscape itself became the enemy. Melting glaciers released toxic runoff that poisoned rivers. Fallout from experimental weapons irradiated entire valleys, and the once pristine wilderness of Alaska turned into a wasteland long before the bombs of 2077 ever fell. The soldiers who survived spoke of hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation, frostbite, and radiation exposure. Some claimed to see cities beneath the ice, remnants of civilizations older than memory. Others swore that the land itself whispered, begging them to leave. Superstition took hold even among officers, who began to refer to certain sectors of the front as cursed zones, where machines malfunctioned, men vanished, and even the auroras burned blood red. The war had broken not only bodies but reality itself. And yet, in the minds of those far from the front, Anchorage was still a beacon, a symbol of perseverance. The government fed that illusion because it needed it. Without the myth of Alaska, America had nothing left to believe in. Thus, the war for the North dragged on. A glacial apocalypse fought in slow motion, measured not in battles but in the erosion of hope. For every inch of frozen ground gained or lost, thousands perished. And still both sides declared progress. Beneath the lies and the slogans, the truth was unchanging. This was not a war to secure the future, but to delay the inevitable. The world was dying, and its last giants were clawing at the Arctic ice, too proud to admit they were already ghosts. In that silence, in that endless storm, the stage was set for the event that would define the final generation, the operation that promised liberation and delivered damnation. By the time the Alaskan tundra had been painted in the black soot of artillery fire, the war's purpose had already shifted from victory to extraction, and the words freedom and liberation had become little more than marketing slogans for the industry of survival. Beneath the frost and the silence lay the true prize of the Anchorage campaign: oil, the black blood of a dying planet, still pulsing through frozen veins of pipeline and permafrost. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline had once been the marvel of pre-war engineering, a steel artery stretching hundreds of miles from the Prudhoe Bay oil fields to the warm refineries of Valdez, but by the 2072, it was a crippled relic, sabotaged, patched, and defended as fiercely as any capital city. The United States knew that its entire civilization hung on this one lifeline. Without Alaskan oil, tanks would rust, vertibirds would fall silent, and the myth of American strength would wither before the world could see the truth. The Chinese knew it too. Their offensive into Alaska was not simply invasion, it was a desperate act of energy triage, an attempt to seize the last accessible petroleum reserves on Earth before the lights went out. What neither side would admit, even to themselves, was that the war had already been lost the moment humanity began fighting for what little remained, instead of creating something new. In the boardrooms of Washington and Beijing, the battle for the oil fields became a game of numbers. Satellites tracked production yields. Analysts estimated how many more weeks of fuel could sustain the war. Every drop pumped from the Alaskan earth was immediately swallowed by tanks and power armor reactors. Refining capacity in Anchorage was limited, forcing both nations to innovate in ways that defied ethics and physics alike. American engineers experimented with fusion catalysts and hybrid chemical cores to stretch their dwindling petroleum reserves, while Chinese technicians turned to exotic, synthetic fuels derived from carbon reclamation. These new compounds burned hotter, faster, and deadlier, coating the sky with auroras of chemical flame. The air above the oil fields shimmered like glass. Soldiers said the snow itself tasted of fuel. The battle zones of Prudhoe Bay and the Trans-Alaska Corridor became hellscapes of fire and frost, where flamethrowers hissed in sub-zero temperatures, and men died for barrels whose contents could no longer save them. The United States declared each new refinery secured as a step toward liberation, but in reality, every victory was a countdown to scarcity. Each pipeline restored today was one less resource tomorrow. The propaganda reels shown to the American public depicted proud engineers raising flags over pumping stations. But the classified field reports painted a different picture. Entire battalions were being sacrificed to defend wells that produced less than a fraction of pre-war output. Frozen rigs clogged with ice and debris demanded constant repair, often under enemy bombardment. Commanders joked grimly that more soldiers died tightening valves than from gunfire, yet the political machine demanded symbols of hope. And so, the oil fields of tomorrow became the official slogan of the campaign, a promise that energy abundance was just beyond the next ridge. Government broadcasts told citizens that these reserves would fuel a renaissance of peace once the Chinese were expelled. But inside the Pentagon, scientists quietly reported that the reserves were already approaching depletion. America's dream of tomorrow was a mirage built on fumes. To sustain the illusion, corporations stepped in. Robco offered automation packages for remote extraction, deploying legions of protectrons and sentry bots to guard and maintain the rigs, reducing human casualties but creating new forms of failure. In the cold, circuits froze, oil thickened into tar, and robotic units froze mid-stride. Monuments of steel entombed in ice. Westtech's contribution was the development of self-contained mini-reactors that could power small refineries independently of the main grid. A prototype later adapted for civilian use as fusion cores. These technological miracles were hailed as breakthroughs in the media, but every one was designed with the same unspoken purpose: to extract more from a planet that had nothing left to give. The war for the oil fields became an act of self-cannibalism, as each innovation consumed the last fragments of ingenuity humanity still possessed. China mirrored this desperation with its own atrocities. Having lost most of its coastal oil infrastructure to environmental collapse, the People's Liberation Army sought to reverse engineer American refinery technology on site, converting captured facilities into hybrid plants that processed whatever hydrocarbons they could salvage. Civilians were enslaved as laborers, digging through snow for frozen crude, and prisoners of war were forced to work until they collapsed. The Chinese command justified it as strategic reclamation, but the records that survived the bombs show that the mortality rate among these workers was nearly total. The PLA had promised its soldiers that Anchorage would deliver victory and prosperity. Instead, it delivered mass graves and tainted fuel that corroded their own machines. By 2075, the Chinese front lines were plagued with mechanical failures, as inferior synthetic oils froze or exploded in reactors, and their once formidable army began to stall. Yet the human cost did not stop the generals. By then, victory had become an article of faith, and faith does not yield to reason. For the Americans, the oil war also became a theater of corruption. Military contractors inflated supply reports, shipping empty barrels marked as secured resources to justify continued funding. Officers falsified enemy body counts, replacing data with optimism to secure promotions. Behind the heroism of public broadcasts lay a bureaucratic abyss where the truth disappeared into classified archives. The Department of Energy and the Department of Defense fought over jurisdiction, and the President's War Council demanded that the campaign appear successful regardless of outcome. Propaganda artists painted murals of the fuel of freedom, while technicians quietly dismantled abandoned rigs for parts. Those who spoke out were silenced or reassigned. When a whistleblower colonel attempted to reveal that the oil fields had fallen below viable extraction levels, he was declared missing in action. Officially, his transport crashed during a snowstorm. Unofficially, he was erased. Meanwhile, among the soldiers, a darker mythology took root. They began to refer to the oil itself as black ice, believing it to be cursed, that it demanded blood for every gallon drawn. Superstition replaced doctrine, and field chaplains preached sermons equating the flow of oil with divine judgment. Men said that when a well ignited, the flames screamed, as if the earth itself was protesting. In Anchorage, the sky glowed for months from the fires of sabotaged refineries, creating false dawns that confused circadian rhythms and broke men's sanity. The air smelled of burning plastic, and visibility dropped to yards. Yet in Washington, senators toasted to progress, their speeches broadcast against a backdrop of victory marches. The disconnect between image and reality grew so vast that even frontline reporters stopped trying to tell the truth. The oil fields of tomorrow had become both a lie and a confession, a promise that the future could be manufactured out of extinction. By 2076, the last great push for Alaska's resources was underway. American forces launched Operation Blind Winter, a series of coordinated offensives to reclaim the final Chinese-held refineries near the Arctic coast. Supported by vertibirds, power-armored divisions, and mechanized infantry, they surged forward under blinding storms, burning more fuel in a week than the pipelines could replenish in a month. When the smoke cleared, the Americans held the ruins, but the victory was hollow. The remaining wells were destroyed, the refineries unusable, and the surrounding landscape rendered uninhabitable by chemical and radiological fallout. The U.S. declared it a decisive triumph. In truth, it was the funeral of the Old World's energy age. From that point on, the war was powered not by oil, but by inertia, the momentum of a civilization too terrified to stop moving. In the years that followed, as the flames of the oil fields dimmed beneath layers of snow and ash, humanity's dependence on fossil fuel was replaced by the tyranny of fusion. What had begun as a resource war ended as an existential experiment in survival technology. The seeds of West Tech's future inventions, the FEV, the fusion cores, the power armor that would walk across the ruins of the post-war world, all found their genesis in the oil fields of Anchorage. The scientists who oversaw those projects called it progress. The soldiers who bled for it called it madness. And so the myth of the oil fields of tomorrow endured, a grim parable of mankind's refusal to learn, an echo that would still whisper through the centuries as explorers in the wasteland unearthed rusted barrels and wondered why the world had died. In the frozen silence of Alaska's graveyards, the oil that once promised salvation had instead baptized humanity in fire, and its black stains could never be washed away. The Alaskan snows had been stained with the rust of tank treads and the blood of frozen men, and the American war machine had become something no longer bound by politics or even humanity. It was a living organism, fed by industry, pulsing with power cells and propaganda, driven by algorithms of necessity that no longer required conscience to function. The liberation of Anchorage had transformed from a campaign into a crucible, where the machinery of war outgrew the men who built it. In factories across the continental United States, assembly lines ran day and night, producing weapons faster than soldiers could be trained to use them. Automation had long been hailed as the savior of labor, but in wartime it became the engine of annihilation. Robco, General Atomics, Poseidon Energy, all had merged their efforts under the Defense Production Initiative, a government decree that erased competition and replaced it with total mobilization. Every machine built was a soldier. every innovation a potential weapon. The American dream was melted down and reforged into steel and circuitry, and soon even the generals no longer commanded the war, they merely managed it. In Anchorage, the tangible face of that transformation was the Power Armored Division. What had begun as an experimental project under West Tech's Advanced Power Armor Research Program had evolved into the T-45 series, a mobile fortress that turned infantrymen into walking tanks. The suits were marvels of engineering, powered by compact fusion cores, and designed to operate in the extreme cold of the Alaskan front. To the men who wore them, they were salvation. To their enemies, they were an omen of death. Each deployment of a power-armored platoon shifted the balance of the battlefield, and soon the Chinese soldiers whispered of the Iron Ghosts, believing these metal giants to be demons born of Western science. Yet the reality was more complex. The suits amplified the strength of their wearers, but they also magnified their fear. Encased in steel and fed commands through neural uplinks, soldiers became extensions of the machine itself. Their humanity gradually eroded by the armor's hum. Veterans described it as a kind of possession, the sense that once the suit sealed shut, something else took over. They would move, fight, and kill with perfect efficiency. But when the battle ended, many reported feeling detached, as though the war continued somewhere inside their minds. The U.S. Army called it operational dissociation. The soldiers called it iron sleep. As the campaign intensified, so too did the military's dependence on automation. The Protectron sentries that once patrolled civilian zones were repurposed for battlefield logistics. The SentryBot, once a limited prototype, became a mass-produced terror, capable of deploying mini-nuclear payloads and sustained heavy fire. Anchorage's frozen plains echoed with the mechanical roar of engines and the metallic shriek of servos under strain. The machines did not tire, did not freeze, and did not question orders. For the High Command, this was perfection. But perfection has a cost. When systems malfunctioned, entire squads were wiped out by friendly fire. When targeting protocols failed, civilians were categorized as hostiles. The Anchorage archives record entire villages cleared under the assumption of enemy infiltration, though post-war investigations found no evidence of Chinese presence. The war machine, in its hunger for efficiency, had erased the boundaries between necessity and atrocity. Commanders no longer signed off on strikes. Algorithms did. The military-industrial complex had achieved its ultimate goal: self-sufficiency. Within the continental U.S., the transformation was no less profound. Civilian industries were nationalized, their production redirected to the war effort. Automobile factories were retooled to build vertibird chassis. Domestic robotics divisions were conscripted to design autonomous logistics drones. Even the entertainment sector was harnessed for propaganda. The Ministry of Morale distributed films celebrating the mechanization of war, portraying robots and soldiers as brothers in arms, guardians of the American way. But beneath the glossy veneer of unity lay the truth of exploitation. Workers were subjected to impossible quotas. Industrial accidents were covered up. Unions were dissolved under the Defense Moratorium Act, and dissent was reclassified as treason. Those who questioned the ethics of total mobilization simply disappeared. The line between patriot and prisoner blurred as the nation consumed itself in the name of victory. The war machine had no loyalty, only function. The scientists who once dreamed of progress now found themselves trapped within the machine's iron grip. West Tech's engineers, once hailed as innovators, were now prisoners of their own creations. The military demanded results without regard for consequence, pushing for faster, deadlier, more autonomous designs. Power armor prototypes became testbeds for experimental AI integration. Early models of the T-51 series incorporated primitive decision-making algorithms that could override user hesitation, theoretically improving combat efficiency. What it created instead were suits that sometimes refused to disengage, locking soldiers inside until they were manually cut out. Incidents were classified under mechanical anomalies, but survivors whispered of haunted suits, armor that would not let go. The lines between machine and man blurred further with each iteration, and the idea of individual will began to erode within the armed forces. Soldiers became data points, their performance analyzed, their emotions charted. The war machine learned from them, adapted, improved itself. It was no longer a tool, it was evolution. In Anchorage itself, the manifestation of this new order could be seen in the logistics corridors beneath the city. Massive, subterranean complexes housed automated supply systems, where conveyor belts carried ammunition, food, and parts without human oversight. The tunnels pulsed like arteries, and the soldiers joked that they were walking inside the belly of the beast. Surveillance drones patrolled every corridor, their cold eyes ensuring that no deviation from protocol went unnoticed. Privacy ceased to exist. Every soldier was monitored, every action recorded. Those who disobeyed orders were not reprimanded by officers but by systems, denied access to supplies, flagged for behavioral correction. The military called it integrated discipline. The men called it machine judgment. China, desperate to match this industrial colossus, began to adopt its own versions of automation. Drone fleets, remote-piloted tanks, and bio-enhanced infantry were deployed against the Americans. But without the infrastructure to sustain them, these innovations became unreliable, prone to catastrophic failure in the cold. The Americans saw this as proof of superiority, but the Chinese saw something else, proof that humanity itself was obsolete. Both nations were becoming mirrors of each other, reflections of a species that had surrendered its moral compass to circuitry. The Anchorage front became the testing ground for ideas that would one day define the post-war wasteland: unmanned warfare, AI governance, synthetic soldiers. It was there that humanity first glimpsed its mechanical replacement. Even after victory was declared, the war machine refused to stop. Production lines continued to operate, churning out weapons with no battlefield left to claim. Commanders requested deactivation orders that never came, because the bureaucracy that governed them no longer had a clear definition of peace. The factories had become self-perpetuating ecosystems, feeding on resources, consuming the world piece by piece. In the archives of the pre-war Pentagon, declassified decades later, one memo described this phenomenon as the iron continuum, a state in which industrial momentum could no longer be reversed without collapsing the entire economy. America had become the machine it built, a nation that could not survive without war. And so, as the last Chinese strongholds in Anchorage fell, and the stars above Alaska flickered through curtains of smoke, the soldiers who remained began to understand the truth. The war had not been fought for victory or freedom. It had been fought to feed the machine, to keep it alive long enough to sustain the illusion that humanity was still in control. They had won the battle, but lost the meaning of being human. Power armor would survive the centuries that followed, worn by scavengers and soldiers of the wasteland. Symbols of a strength humanity could never again live without. The same suits that liberated Anchorage would later walk through the ashes of civilization, carrying the echo of that iron heartbeat. The war machine had won, not through conquest, but through endurance. Its grip remained unbroken, long after the bombs fell, long after nations died. It became the inheritance of a world rebuilt on ruins, a world that could never remember how to stop building its own destruction. The human cost of the Anchorage campaign extended far beyond the frozen battlefield, penetrating into the very soul of a nation already teetering on the edge of exhaustion. And it was there, in the homes and hearts of ordinary Americans, that the war revealed its most insidious effects, the quiet decay that no propaganda could mask. As the military-industrial complex demanded ever greater manpower, the Selective Service and the newly expanded conscription laws reached into towns and cities across the continental United States, plucking teenagers, office clerks, and technicians from lives they had barely begun to live, dragging them into a conflict that promised glory but delivered suffering. And in the harsh northern frontier, the difference between life and death was measured not by courage, but by proximity to machinery and the whims of logistics. Families tore themselves apart as sons and daughters vanished into the cold, their letters few and censored, returning only as tattered uniforms, as casualties in the official tallies, or not at all, leaving empty chairs at tables that had once been centers of warmth and conversation. Propaganda campaigns, broadcast continuously through holoscreens, radio waves, and civic postings, painted each loss as noble, each conscript as a hero of freedom, each factory burned out, or pipeline sabotaged as a testament to the nation's resilience. Yet beneath the surface, despair festered in the hearts of those who understood the emptiness of such declarations, who counted the missing and realized that victory was a word invented to shield them from the scale of their grief. Posters of smiling soldiers clad in power armor decorated every corner of the mainland, promising that the war was righteous, that every death was meaningful. But for those living amidst the ration lines and recruitment notices, it became impossible to reconcile the images of triumph with the hollow ache of absence. The children who grew up without fathers, the mothers who learned that a knock on the door might bring news of irreparable loss rather than relief. In the town's nearest draft boards, neighborhoods emptied as households sent their members north to Alaska or into training facilities designed to harden men and women into instruments of war, stripping away individuality in favor of conformity. And those who remained were often pressed into support roles, volunteering or conscripted to maintain supply chains, repair equipment, and manufacture the very weapons that would claim their neighbors. Hospitals overflowed with injuries and frostbite cases long before the front lines had fully stabilized, and yet the federal government continued to report manageable attrition while rationing medical care to those deemed non-essential, creating a hierarchy of human value based entirely on military utility. Even education systems were militarized, with schools instructing children in war drills, chemical and radiation safety, and the patriotic imperatives of sacrifice, framing death and disappearance as noble rites of passage. Religious institutions, once independent arbiters of morality, were co-opted into the machinery of state propaganda, their sermons rewritten to glorify obedience, to sanctify conscription, to convince the populace that suffering and grief were the currencies of freedom. Clergy who resisted these changes were silenced or removed under charges of sedition, and the few who dared question the morality of endless recruitment and mass casualty reporting were relegated to anonymity, their names scrubbed from records, their voices lost to the cold. On the front lines of Anchorage itself, the human toll was equally stark, but even more immediate, as soldiers faced a combination of environmental extremity, mechanical warfare, and psychological attrition that eroded identity and cohesion. The brutal winters of Alaska became a weapon of attrition in themselves. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed more men, in some months, than bullets and shrapnel, while the constant scarcity of food, fuel, and fresh clothing created conditions in which camaraderie often failed to counteract desperation. The psychological effects were profound. Soldiers reported hallucinations in whiteout conditions, nightmares that blurred into the waking day, and an increasing sense of alienation from the civilian world they were supposed to defend. Letters home were censored and sanitized, leaving families with only fragments of the reality endured, while military communiques depicted every engagement as precise, every casualty a necessary sacrifice, and every death as honorable. For the men and women who lived these lies day after day, the cost was not just physical, it was moral, as they were required to participate in operations that often involved indiscriminate bombardment, forced evacuations, and even reprisals against populations suspected of aiding enemy forces, all under the justification of national necessity. Back on the mainland, the human cost manifested in invisible, yet devastating ways. The economy, stretched to sustain the Northern Campaign, stripped civilians of autonomy. Citizens were forced into war work, sometimes for 12-hour shifts in freezing factories, sometimes to maintain infrastructure now entirely devoted to feeding the military. Food rationing, energy conservation, and forced relocations became routine, and those unable to comply were subject to fines, imprisonment, or reclassification as expendable. The mental toll was immense. Entire communities existed in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for news that rarely came, witnessing neighbors disappear without explanation, listening to the omnipresent broadcasts, extolling heroism while silently tallying the dead. Many attempted to protest or flee, but the combination of surveillance, militarized police, and nationalistic fervor left few avenues for resistance. Each act of defiance was met with swift punishment, sending a chilling message to those who might question the government's narrative. In this way, the human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. It infected every layer of society, turning civilians into participants in their own oppression, complicit in the war by necessity, by fear, and by exhaustion. Among the conscripted soldiers, the moral decay was compounded by the experience of endless combat and the constant presence of mechanized war. The early T-45 power armor, initially a marvel of military engineering, transformed infantry into instruments of precision destruction, but it also severed the tactile connection between soldier and environment, between action and consequence. In the armored suits, men and women became conduits of destruction, their senses filtered through displays and sensors, their humanity mediated by technology. Reports from field psychologists, often classified for decades, indicate a rise in dissociative behavior, emotional blunting, and post-traumatic stress disorders even before the conclusion of the campaign. Those who survived the harshest engagements often returned home physically intact, but emotionally hollow, struggling to reintegrate into a society that had celebrated their valor, even as it demanded their continued obedience to the machine of war. Veteran stories described a paradoxical sense of pride and shame, honor and horror, a cognitive dissonance imposed by the same propaganda that had trained them to fight without question. Even the soldiers who survived unscathed physically were not spared the human cost. Friendships forged under fire were severed by the arbitrary removal of units, by reassignment, or by death, leaving a sense of impermanence and grief that haunted every action. Letters smuggled between platoons speak of comrades lost to frostbite, disease, or failed missions, and the inability to mourn compounded the trauma. Field chaplains were few and often restricted in their duties, unable to offer solace, and morale officers were instructed to prioritize propaganda over care. Every interaction became a negotiation between survival and obedience, and over time, soldiers internalized the calculus. Efficiency, obedience, and conformity took precedence over empathy, conscience, and self-preservation. The very fabric of society, both on the front lines and back home, was reshaped by this relentless erosion of humanity, creating a culture in which survival was measured not by life or death, but by the willingness to subsume oneself to the needs of the war machine. By the conclusion of the Anchorage campaign, the tally of human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Americans and Chinese dead, countless civilians displaced, and an entire generation of soldiers psychologically scarred before even reaching adulthood. Yet the official narrative remained fixed, unyielding, a monument to patriotic hysteria and moral blindness. Victory, for Washington, was measured not in lives preserved, but in territory reclaimed, resources secured, and the appearance of control maintained. Families mourned in silence, veterans returned broken, and the civilians who had been conscripted into war labor found themselves unprepared to return to normal life. Their identities intertwined with the campaign in ways that could never be undone. The human cost of the Anchorage campaign was not a footnote in history. It was the true story of the war, a testament to how societies can be consumed by the machinery of conflict, sacrificing their people in the name of honor, progress, and survival, and leaving behind a legacy of grief, trauma, and moral compromise that would echo long after the guns fell silent and the ice reclaimed the scarred landscape. The Anchorage line emerged not as a simple front, but as a sprawling testament to human ingenuity and desperation, a network of trenches, fortifications, and artillery positions carved into the ice and snow, stretching across the tundra like a frozen scar. A defensive perimeter meant to hold back the relentless Chinese advance and serve as the backbone of America's final stand in Alaska, yet it became a living nightmare for the soldiers who manned it, an environment that demanded constant vigilance, endurance, and sacrifice, and offered only the illusion of safety. The line itself was a marvel of military engineering, a web of interlocking strongpoints connected by subterranean supply tunnels, ice-reinforced bunkers, and strategically placed observation towers that allowed commanders to monitor enemy movement across miles of desolate terrain, all while conserving the fragile fuel and ammunition supplies that dictated every maneuver. Each position was built not only to repel an enemy, but to endure the unforgiving climate. Insulated against blizzards that could freeze men and machinery within hours, and yet the cold itself became an unrelenting adversary. As soldiers struggled to keep equipment operational, maintain communication lines, and survive in shelters that often failed under the weight of ice and snow, the perimeter was not static. It shifted with the campaigns, expanded into newly reclaimed territory, and contracted under sustained assaults, forcing units to adapt constantly to changing topography and enemy tactics. Logistics were the lifeblood of the Anchorage line, and without them, every defensive position would have collapsed, leaving the frozen north to become a graveyard for entire battalions. Supply convoys threaded across treacherous mountain passes, ice fields, and glacial crevasses, vulnerable to ambush, mechanical failure, and sudden weather changes that could immobilize men and vehicles alike. And yet these convoys were the invisible sinews that held the line together, carrying ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and replacement soldiers to positions that might never see relief. The soldiers themselves became legends not through glory but endurance, their names whispered in barracks and recorded in dispatches, as small units held entire sectors against numerically superior forces, improvising fortifications, conducting patrols in blinding storms, and improvising with what little technology they could access, often scavenging from destroyed equipment or captured enemy supplies. Stories circulated of sniper teams perched on ice ridges for days without sleep, of engineers repairing artillery while frostbite gnawed at their hands, of radio operators who maintained contact with headquarters despite batteries freezing and wires snapping, and these tales became the currency of morale, inspiring fellow soldiers to endure even as death and despair surrounded them. Yet legend and reality often diverged. Many soldiers disappeared into the snow, lost to crevasses or storms, their fates unknown, and official records sometimes claimed them as killed in action, while their bodies remained unrecovered for years, creating a ghostly presence along the line that haunted both comrades and commanders. The Anchorage line was a place where human will met the harshest extremes of nature, and the very act of survival became an achievement equal to battlefield victory, a statement that men could endure, if not triumph, against overwhelming odds. Within this network, tactical innovation was constant. Trench networks were combined with improvised minefields, early automated sentries, and sniper positions hidden beneath snowdrifts, creating layers of defense that could slow or halt enemy advances, buying time for counterattacks and resupply missions. Coordination was critical, with regimental commanders relying on a combination of wireless communication, signal flares, and runners to transmit orders across the frozen expanse, often under fire or during blinding storms. The Chinese assaults tested every innovation, forcing rapid adaptation. Feints across glacial valleys, infiltration teams using the terrain to their advantage, and artillery bombardments that threatened to collapse fortifications in seconds. Soldiers learned to improvise, to use terrain and ice as allies, and to fight not just the enemy but the environment itself, where a misstep could be fatal. The human cost was immense, as casualty rates were high and replacement troops were often inexperienced, thrown into a line that demanded experience, courage, and endurance beyond what most could summon. Despite this, the line held, because behind every soldier was a system of logistics, technology, and determination that refused to yield. The Anchorage line was not just a defensive measure, it was a symbol, a living embodiment of a nation struggling to maintain its identity in a world unraveling around it. Its existence shaped the entire campaign, dictating the timing of offensives, the allocation of resources, and the morale of both sides, and it created a framework upon which the final liberation of Anchorage would be constructed. In the frozen stillness between assaults, soldiers recalled the names of those who had fallen along the line, the sacrifices that had made even small gains possible, and the enduring truth that in a war fought on ice, every inch of ground claimed was paid for in human endurance and suffering. The Anchorage line was more than a military strategy. It was the spine of a campaign that tested the limits of man, machine, and nation, and its legacy would endure long after the last artillery shell fell, a monument to what humanity could achieve and what it could lose when faced with the relentless machinery of war and the frozen crucible of the North. The Chinese offensive on Anchorage was a campaign that would test the limits of human endurance, technological ingenuity, and moral fortitude, a brutal push that nearly shattered the American presence in Alaska and left a landscape forever marked by the footprints of war. As the People's Liberation Army, determined to claim the frozen North, marshaled its forces with an unprecedented combination of ambition, discipline, and desperation, sending waves of mechanized infantry, stealth units, and artillery across snow-choked valleys and ice-riddled passes in an attempt to break the American defensive lines that had held for years. The attack was meticulously planned, beginning with infiltration operations that exploited the Arctic terrain, using the cover of blizzards and frozen riverbeds to bypass forward observation posts, strike at supply depots, and isolate American platoons, while specialized commando teams sabotaged infrastructure, disabled mechanized units, and spread fear among soldiers who had come to rely on the perceived invulnerability of the Anchorage line. Chinese commanders, aware that the Americans had superior numbers and heavy weaponry in key sectors, chose instead to focus on mobility, surprise, and the psychological effects of relentless pressure, knowing that a protracted frontal assault would be costly, and that victory could only be achieved through calculated shock and attrition. The initial wave caught many units off guard, forcing hasty reallocation of reserves and creating temporary gaps in the defensive perimeter, which American officers and soldiers struggled to fill amidst driving snow, biting winds, and the constant threat of mechanical failure that characterized the extreme environment of the North. The PLA's approach was unrelenting. Night assaults were launched against isolated bunkers, aerial strikes targeted supply convoys, and coordinated attacks aimed to overwhelm power-armored platoons before reinforcements could arrive. The fighting was relentless, with soldiers on both sides enduring frostbite, exhaustion, and the ever-present risk of death from both the enemy and the environment, and casualties mounted as men and women were pushed to extremes of endurance, often operating on minimal rations and with equipment that froze or malfunctioned under the unyielding cold. At the same time, the human cost of the offensive revealed itself in ways that transcended conventional battlefield losses, as both American and Chinese units committed acts of desperation that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent, from the execution of prisoners who could not be transported or fed to retaliatory strikes against civilian settlements caught in the crossfire, and to the forced labor of locals and POWs used to repair or maintain critical supply nodes, often under conditions that guaranteed death. Propaganda on both sides glorified these operations, masking atrocity with rhetoric of heroism. But soldiers who witnessed these events firsthand described the moral erosion that accompanied each tactical decision, a sense that survival and victory had replaced ethics, that obedience to command outweighed conscience, and that the line between right and wrong had been permanently obscured by the demands of a war fought in extremes. Even as the offensive pressed on, technological and logistical limitations constrained the PLA. Frozen artillery pieces jammed, supply lines were severed by American countermeasures, and mechanized units stalled in snowdrifts and ice fields, leaving men exposed and vulnerable to counterattacks. Yet the sheer audacity of the operation, the scale of commitment, and the willingness to accept staggering casualties created a pressure on American forces that tested the ingenuity of commanders and the courage of soldiers alike, forcing improvisation under fire, the construction of emergency fortifications, and the coordination of reinforcements across distances measured in miles. of treacherous terrain. The psychological dimension of the Chinese offensive was as punishing as the physical, as soldiers reported a constant sense of being hunted, of the enemy appearing where least expected, and of the blizzard itself conspiring against them, masking movement and amplifying the terror of the night. Stories from survivors speak of entire platoons isolated for days, their communications cut, watching shadows glide across snowfields, hearing the echo of artillery not aimed at them but whose effects carried across valleys, and feeling a profound isolation compounded by the knowledge that the enemy had penetrated lines previously considered secure. Commanders leveraged every advantage, from electronic jamming to diversionary attacks, to counter these psychological pressures. Yet the strain was unmistakable, and instances of desertion, breakdown, and fatal misjudgment increased as the offensive continued. Meanwhile, both sides struggled to maintain supply chains, with sled convoys, vertibirds, and rail networks constantly threatened by sabotage, mechanical failure, or enemy fire, underscoring the harsh reality that the northern environment was as deadly as any human opponent, and that victory required mastery not only of tactics but of survival itself. Despite the intensity of the Chinese offensive, American forces ultimately managed to stabilize the Anchorage line through a combination of reinforcements, tactical ingenuity, and the deployment of early experimental weaponry, including mechanized infantry and early power-armored units that absorbed assaults that would have decimated conventional soldiers. The Americans leveraged terrain, weather, and technological innovation to counteract the enemy's mobility, turning blizzards into obstacles, ridges into choke points, and frozen rivers into death traps for attacking columns. Yet the human toll remained staggering, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or psychologically shattered in a campaign that would later be remembered as one of the most desperate and grueling confrontations of the Anchorage War. Survivors spoke of weeks spent under continuous bombardment, of comrades lost to frostbite as well as fire, and of nights in trenches where sleep was impossible, and fear a constant companion, and the memory of the offensive haunted them long after the battlefield was secured. The myths and legends born of the Chinese offensive endured in both wartime and post-war narratives, with tales of heroic last stands, miraculous counterattacks, and ghostly apparitions of soldiers lost in the snow, circulating among troops and civilians alike, though the reality was often far more grim, a testament to endurance, desperation, and survival under conditions that defied imagination. Both nations attempted to frame the offensive in their own narratives. The Americans portrayed it as a near defeat that showcased ingenuity and bravery, while the Chinese framed it as a valiant effort hindered by environmental extremes and logistical limitations, each side emphasizing heroism while downplaying the brutality, chaos, and moral compromises that defined the campaign. In the end, the Chinese offensive represented not only the peak of military tension in Anchorage, but also a crucible in which soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike were forced to confront the limits of endurance, the corrosive effects of propaganda and desperation, and the inescapable reality that in a war fought across frozen expanses, survival itself was a measure of victory, and humanity often paid a price far greater than any territorial gain. Operation Anchorage represented the pinnacle of American ambition and desperation in the frozen North, a campaign that combined audacious planning, experimental technology, and the unyielding human drive to reclaim what had been lost, and it was under the command of General Constantine Chase that this decisive push transformed the Anchorage battlefield from a landscape of attrition into a crucible of innovation, strategy, and unprecedented brutality, a march toward liberation that would define the final chapter of America's northern struggle. Chase, a veteran of earlier campaigns who had witnessed the attritional horrors of the first winters, conceived a plan that relied on speed, precision, and the concentrated use of experimental weaponry, recognizing that conventional approaches had yielded nothing but stalemate and blood. The operation began with an intensive intelligence campaign, employing reconnaissance teams, early unmanned drones, and captured enemy documents to map Chinese defensive positions with an accuracy previously thought impossible in such extreme conditions. Every approach, ridge, valley, and frozen river was studied, and every unit trained to execute maneuvers that combined terrain mastery with maximum firepower, a choreography that demanded both discipline and courage. Soldiers were briefed extensively on the stakes. Anchorage was the key to both logistical supremacy in Alaska and the symbolic heart of American morale, and failure would mean not merely defeat, but a collapse of national credibility in a war already consuming a generation. The campaign commenced in the bitterest part of winter, when temperatures plummeted and storms swept across the tundra with little warning, turning every advance into a test of endurance as well as skill. American forces deployed in coordinated columns, with power-armored units spearheading assaults to absorb enemy fire, mechanized infantry following to secure positions, and artillery providing suppressive fire from frozen ridges. The T-45 and early T-51B power armor models were pushed to the front, their fusion cores straining in sub-zero conditions, amplifying soldier strength and mobility, while simultaneously creating psychological shock among the Chinese defenders, who had not anticipated a concentrated deployment of such armored units in the field. Engineers and combat technicians moved alongside, repairing equipment on the fly, clearing obstacles, and fortifying captured positions to withstand counterattacks, creating a rhythm of advance that was relentless and exacting. Soldiers described the campaign as moving in a pattern that was almost musical in precision, each unit a note in a symphony of destruction. Yet every note carried the weight of human suffering and the shadow of death, as frostbite, exhaustion, and enemy fire claimed lives even as territory was gained. One of the defining aspects of Operation Anchorage was the integration of experimental weaponry and tactical innovation, which Chase leveraged to compensate for both environmental hazards and the entrenched Chinese defenses. This included advanced guided artillery systems, prototype flamethrowers capable of operating in freezing temperatures, and modified missile units designed to clear ice-obstructed choke points. American engineers also experimented with early cybernetic enhancements for select troops, creating squads with accelerated reflexes and improved endurance through neural uplinks, although the psychological toll of such augmentation was immediate and severe, with soldiers experiencing sensory overload, confusion, and extreme fatigue. Field reports from the operation describe moments of surreal horror, where men in power armor moved like ghosts across the ice, firing weapons with unerring precision, while conventional troops struggled to keep pace, their breath frosting in the wind, their fingers numb, their minds clouded by the combination of cold, fear, and constant exposure to death. Despite these hardships, the Americans advanced, exploiting gaps in the Chinese defensive lines and applying pressure that forced the enemy to divert units from other sectors, creating opportunities that Chase's commanders were quick to exploit. The march toward Anchorage was not merely a series of assaults, it was a psychological war as much as a physical one. Propaganda teams accompanied units, broadcasting messages designed to demoralize Chinese soldiers, emphasizing the inevitability of American success, the futility of resistance, and the moral righteousness of surrender. The Chinese responded in kind, using loudspeakers, leaflets, and intermittent radio transmissions to remind their troops that the United States was overextended, that winter favored the defenders, and that sacrifice for the motherland was greater than survival. Amid this cacophony, the soldiers in the field were left to interpret their own reality, facing a constant barrage of information, disinformation, and uncertainty, and the mental strain became as much a weapon as any artillery barrage or infantry charge. Survival demanded not only skill but an acceptance of relentless loss, an understanding that comrades would die, that victory might come only after weeks or months of grinding attrition, and that each step forward was paid for in blood, frost, and exhaustion. General Chase's strategic genius lay in his ability to integrate all elements of the campaign into a single, coherent plan that balanced speed, concentration, and deception. Diversionary attacks drew Chinese forces into prepared kill zones. Artillery barrages, softened positions, and mechanized columns cut off retreats, while engineers and infantry secured key nodes along the frozen supply lines. Each phase of the operation was timed with precision, synchronized to weather patterns, enemy movements, and logistical constraints. Yet the human element remained central as commanders relied on the courage, endurance, and improvisation of soldiers who operated under conditions that would have broken lesser men. Reports from survivors recall days without sleep, hours without food, and nights spent digging positions under snow while artillery shells screamed overhead. Yet morale was maintained through small victories, camaraderie, and the promise of completing the operation that had been years in the making. As Operation Anchorage progressed, the cost became ever more visible. Entire units were consumed in frontal assaults against heavily fortified positions. Frostbite and exposure claimed nearly as many as bullets and explosives. Psychological strain manifested in combat, stress, hallucinations, and the gradual erosion of individuality as soldiers became instruments in a vast, coordinated machine. Yet, despite the devastation, the operation achieved results that had previously seemed impossible. Chinese defensive positions were systematically reduced, supply depots captured or destroyed, and strategic points within Anchorage itself were brought under American control. The final push culminated in a series of coordinated assaults that forced remaining Chinese forces to retreat, leaving the city battered, frozen, and scarred, but under American dominion. Soldiers described the moment of occupation as surreal. Streets littered with debris, artillery craters filled with ice, and the skeletal remains of both men and machines serving as silent witnesses to the cost of victory. Operation Anchorage, in its execution and aftermath, exemplified the brutal calculus of modern warfare: speed and innovation versus endurance and morality, technological superiority versus human limitation, and the transformation of a society into a war machine capable of overwhelming opposition, yet increasingly alienated from its own humanity. The campaign demonstrated that liberation, when measured in territory and symbols of control, could be achieved at immense cost to the people who fought it, and that the human, environmental, and moral consequences of such operations would echo far beyond the frozen North, shaping the post-war reality of Alaska, the military-industrial complex, and the veterans who survived. To remember, to mourn, and to haunt the narrative of America's final campaign before the Great War. The power armor revolution emerged as both salvation and curse on the frozen battlefields of Anchorage, a technological leap that transformed infantry into walking fortresses and reshaped the very nature of combat, yet carried with it consequences that would haunt soldiers and strategists alike for decades to come. As the United States, desperate to maintain its hold on Alaska, poured resources, expertise, and ambition into the T-45 and later the T-51B units, creating machines that could turn the tide of battle but demanded sacrifices in humanity, endurance, and moral clarity. The earliest iterations, the T-45 series, were conceived in the laboratories of West Tech under the supervision of engineers who understood that raw steel and power cores alone would not suffice. Mobility, environmental protection, and integration with conventional troops were essential to survival in sub-zero climates and under constant enemy fire. Soldiers trained in the suits experienced a form of empowerment, unlike any in military history. The fusion core pumped energy to servos that amplified strength and endurance. Reinforced plating deflected bullets and shrapnel, and integrated targeting systems enhanced precision under conditions that would incapacitate ordinary humans. Yet this empowerment came at the cost of autonomy, as the suit's complex systems required discipline, technical knowledge, and the constant attention of both wearer and field engineers to function properly. Early tests were brutal, with soldiers suffering from overheating, neural strain, and fusion core malfunctions that occasionally led to catastrophic failure. And yet the potential of these machines was undeniable. A platoon of T-45 armored soldiers could hold positions against forces many times their size, their presence alone reshaping tactical calculations and forcing the Chinese to adapt to threats previously unimaginable on the frozen front. The introduction of the T-51B units marked a leap beyond the T-45, integrating lighter materials, improved fusion cores, and advanced sensor suites that enhanced situational awareness and allowed for extended field operations. These suits were faster, more resilient, and capable of sustained combat in conditions that had previously ground human forces to a halt, and their deployment during Operation Anchorage demonstrated a revolution in warfare, as mechanized columns could punch through enemy lines, hold strategic points against counterattacks, and perform missions that would have been suicidal for unarmored troops. Yet alongside their battlefield effectiveness came a new set of consequences. Soldiers reported psychological dissociation, a sense of detachment from their own bodies and surroundings, as the neural interfaces integrated them with the suit, mediating perception and response in a way that blurred the line between human decision and mechanical automation. Field reports documented heightened aggression, impaired emotional response, and an increasing dependence on the suits for both survival and combat effectiveness, creating a cycle in which soldiers' identities became inseparable from their armor. Veterans would later describe the experience as both exhilarating and terrifying, a form of empowerment that isolated them from their own humanity. And in many ways, the T-45 and T-51B became as much a psychological tool of the military-industrial complex as a weapon of war. The deployment of power armor also reshaped military doctrine on Anchorage's frozen front, transforming the strategies employed by both American and Chinese commanders. Previously, defense and offense were constrained by manpower, terrain, and environmental extremes. With armored units, the United States could concentrate firepower in specific sectors, outflank entrenched positions, and absorb attacks that would have shattered conventional infantry lines. American tactics evolved to incorporate mechanized spearheads, combined arms approaches, integrated logistics to support the suits in the field, while engineers developed mobile maintenance units capable of repairing or refueling armor under fire, often in sub-zero temperatures, that would incapacitate unprotected troops. The psychological impact on Chinese forces was profound, as reports describe units hesitating to advance, freezing under the perceived invulnerability of the armored soldiers, and suffering morale collapse when conventional weapons proved insufficient to pierce the suit's defenses. Chinese commanders adapted through guerrilla tactics, concentrated artillery, and infiltration teams, but the sheer presence of power armor imposed a permanent strategic pressure, forcing the opposition into defensive postures and reactive maneuvers, effectively allowing smaller American units to achieve disproportionate influence over the battlefield. Despite their advantages, the suits were not without flaw, and their revolutionary potential was shadowed by the costs incurred in both human and material terms. Fusion cores were limited in number and prone to failure. Field damage often rendered a suit inoperable until technicians could repair it under hazardous conditions, and extreme cold caused hydraulic systems to seize, sensors to malfunction, and plating to crack, creating vulnerabilities that required constant adaptation. The psychological toll on soldiers was compounded by the knowledge that their survival was inseparable from the functioning of the machine. A malfunction or loss of power could be fatal, turning the symbol of strength into a coffin of steel. Reports from the field indicate that prolonged operations in armor led to sensory overload, extreme fatigue, and a detachment from moral responsibility, as soldiers focused on the mechanics of movement, targeting, and survival, rather than the broader consequences of their actions. This detachment facilitated acts that would later be morally questioned, including the suppression of surrendering forces, the destruction of civilian infrastructure deemed strategically useful, and the participation in retaliatory actions against villages suspected of aiding the enemy, demonstrating that technological empowerment could erode ethical constraints even as it increased battlefield effectiveness. The cultural and symbolic impact of the power armor revolution extended beyond the battlefield. Within American propaganda, images of armored soldiers were broadcast to reinforce narratives of invincibility, patriotism, and technological superiority, portraying the suits as icons of national pride, a visible embodiment of American ingenuity and resolve. Soldiers themselves became living symbols, revered for their courage, yet feared for their mechanical transformation, their humanity inseparable from the armor that defined them. In post-war analysis, historians would note that the T-45 and T-51B were not merely tools, but instruments that reshaped the identity of the military, society, and the very perception of what it meant to fight, survive, and govern in an age of total war. The suits became legacies in themselves, influencing future power armor designs, post-war scavenger economies, and even the mythology of the wasteland, where scavengers and mercenaries would seek out the remnants of these machines, mistaking technology for heroism and heroism for technology. Ultimately, the power armor revolution demonstrated the duality inherent in technological warfare. It could save lives, while eroding morality. It could turn impossible odds into tactical victories, while creating dependence, and it could inspire awe while fostering fear and detachment. The frozen battlefields of Anchorage became the proving grounds for a paradigm that would echo through the wasteland long after the last Chinese soldiers had retreated. long after the city itself was rebuilt and long after the survivors returned to a society struggling to understand the cost of victory. In the suit's cold embrace, soldiers found both supremacy and isolation, strength and alienation, and the revolution in armor became inseparable from the revolution in the human psyche, leaving a legacy that was as enduring and as haunting as the ice that had witnessed it. Victory in the ice was not a moment of triumph painted in bright banners and parades, but a frozen, blood-soaked culmination of years of relentless struggle, a strategic, psychological, and physical conquest that left Anchorage shattered, its streets littered with the remnants of war, and its survivors bearing the weight of a city reclaimed through immense human sacrifice, ingenuity, and sheer endurance, as the final American offensive forced the retreat of Chinese forces from the northern Alaskan territories and established a tenuous dominion over a landscape ravaged by artillery, frost, and the unyielding march of mechanized warfare. The last push toward the heart of the city was a coordinated effort, relying on intelligence gathered from reconnaissance drones, maps obtained through infiltration, and detailed knowledge of Chinese defensive positions, allowing American commanders to direct mechanized infantry, power-armored units, and artillery batteries with unprecedented precision, while simultaneously mitigating the chaos inherent in Arctic warfare, where snowstorms, blizzards, and sub-zero temperatures could immobilize entire units within hours. Soldiers reported the surreal experience of advancing through streets transformed into death traps, buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks, and the eerie silence between artillery strikes, punctuated by the distant cries of the wounded and the mechanical hum of automated sentries still patrolling, enforcing a grim, unyielding rhythm that marked the city itself as a participant in the conflict rather than a passive backdrop. Despite the devastation, coordination among units allowed for systematic clearing of enemy positions, with power armor squads leading the charge, absorbing concentrated fire, and enabling infantry to secure buildings, tunnels, and intersections, while engineers repaired essential infrastructure to maintain supply lines, communications, and evacuation routes, ensuring that momentum could be sustained. Across the frozen urban battlefield, the Chinese forces, though exhausted and outnumbered, fought with tenacity born of desperation, launching counterattacks designed to disrupt supply lines, isolate forward units, and reclaim strategic positions. Yet the Americans, employing both brute force and tactical ingenuity, managed to contain and neutralize these efforts, turning terrain, frozen streets, and the very winter itself into tools of defense. Artillery barrages combined with mechanized flanking maneuvers created kill zones that decimated counterattacking forces, while reconnaissance teams identified weak points in Chinese fortifications, allowing targeted strikes that minimized the risk to American soldiers while maximizing enemy casualties. Amid this calculated devastation, however, the human cost remained staggering. Frostbite, exhaustion, and exposure claimed countless lives alongside bullets and shrapnel, while the psychological toll on soldiers and civilians alike was immense, as the city became a frozen tableau of suffering, heroism, and survival, each street and building bearing witness to the extremes of human endurance. Victory was formalized not by flags raised or ceremonies conducted, but by the systematic collapse of organized Chinese resistance, as surviving units retreated in disarray toward Canada, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and the frozen dead, a grim testament to the effectiveness of the coordinated American offensive. Soldiers and commanders alike described the moment of control as surreal and hollow, a victory measured not in joy but in survival, and the knowledge that the battle had demanded every ounce of skill, courage, and sacrifice available. Civilian populations, those who had endured occupation, bombardment, and forced labor, emerged to witness a city physically liberated but morally and psychologically scarred, their lives forever altered by months of war and deprivation. In the aftermath, the focus shifted quickly from battlefield operations to stabilization, repair, and consolidation, as the military sought to secure supply lines, rebuild critical infrastructure, and prevent insurgent or isolated enemy forces from reigniting conflict, all under the looming shadow of a nation already stretched thin by years of total mobilization and societal strain. Yet, even in the midst of victory, the narratives propagated by the military and political leadership framed the campaign as a decisive triumph of American ingenuity, bravery, and moral superiority, emphasizing technological innovation, the role of power armor, and the effectiveness of strategic planning, while largely omitting the staggering human and material costs, the environmental devastation, and the psychological trauma endured by soldiers and civilians alike. Reports highlighted territorial gains, neutralized enemy positions, and restored control of critical resources, portraying the campaign as a turning point in the broader war and a symbol of national resilience, a narrative that would later form the basis of propaganda, historical documentation, and even entertainment recreations. Yet the reality remained far more nuanced, a mixture of accomplishment, horror, and exhaustion that challenged conventional notions of victory. Soldiers returning from the front described victory as bitter, as the streets of Anchorage bore silent testimony to comrades lost, civilians displaced, and the relentless machinery of war that had defined their lives for months or years. And even as American forces celebrated the reclamation of the city, the lingering effects of frostbite, exposure, psychological strain, and moral compromise created an invisible battlefield within the minds and bodies of those who survived. Victory in the ice thus became both an achievement and a cautionary tale, demonstrating the capacity of human ingenuity, coordination, and technological advancement to overcome extraordinary challenges, while simultaneously revealing the limits of endurance, the depth of sacrifice required, and the ethical ambiguities inherent in total war. The liberation of Anchorage marked the end of organized combat in Alaska, yet it also set the stage for the post-war realities that would shape American society, military doctrine, and historical memory, a reminder that triumph in war is rarely absolute, and that every victory carries with it the imprint of cost, loss, and human endurance stretched to its limits. In this way, the ice itself, the frozen terrain, and the scars of combat became enduring symbols, reminders of a city reclaimed, a campaign concluded, and a nation that had survived the extremes of nature, warfare, and human ambition, but not without leaving behind consequences that would echo long after the guns fell silent. The lies of liberation began even before the last Chinese units had been expelled from Anchorage, a carefully constructed narrative that transformed brutal struggle into sanitized triumph, elevating technological prowess, strategic brilliance, and patriotic heroism while obscuring the immense human cost, environmental devastation, and political maneuvering that defined the campaign. As military leaders, government officials, and corporate interests collaborated to present the liberation of Alaska not as a bloody ordeal, but as a symbol of American ingenuity, resilience, and moral superiority, a story designed to unify a fractured society and justify sacrifices already paid in blood, frost, and despair. Official reports emphasized power armor breakthroughs, the precision of coordinated assaults, and the genius of commanders like General Constantine Chase, while glossing over the countless deaths of conscripted soldiers, the suffering of civilians, and the instances of moral compromise and atrocity that had occurred under the pressures of extreme weather, isolation, and total war. Each victory was meticulously documented in press releases and propaganda films, where frozen cities were depicted as reclaimed through courage and technology, rather than acknowledging the grinding attrition, supply shortages, and environmental hazards that had dictated the pace and outcome of every engagement. The narrative was reinforced through the media, holotapes, and textbooks, creating a monolithic version of history that valorized select units, glorified mechanized operations, and emphasized strategic triumph, effectively transforming the lived reality of suffering, exhaustion, and moral ambiguity into a story of unassailable heroism and patriotic righteousness. Behind the public facade, classified reports revealed a far different picture, one that documented mismanaged operations, failed assaults, preventable casualties, and the deep psychological trauma inflicted on soldiers, civilians alike. These reports noted that frostbite claimed as many, if not more, lives than enemy fire, that supply convoys had frequently failed to reach their destinations, and that the environmental hazards of Alaska had rendered many technological advantages less effective than official accounts suggested. Casualty numbers were deliberately minimized or reclassified. Soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress were omitted from statistical records, and failures in command were recast as tactical necessity or heroic sacrifice, creating a divergence between reality and the official story that would persist for decades. The lies were not merely bureaucratic, they were ideological, designed to maintain morale on the home front, to justify the expenditure of human and material resources, and to construct a narrative of American exceptionalism that could withstand scrutiny. Propaganda being weaponized to reshape perception, erase doubt, and cultivate a sense of inevitability surrounding the nation's eventual survival in the war effort. Corporate interests were also deeply entwined in the propagation of these lies, with contractors such as Robco and General Atomics leveraging the campaign's narrative to sell technology, secure post-war contracts, and rewrite the story of industrial contribution into a tale of national salvation. Weapon prototypes, power armor models, and automated systems were not only marketed as essential tools of victory, but also mythologized as symbols of the United States' moral and technological superiority, blurring the line between strategic necessity and corporate self-interest. Holotapes and newsreels highlighted flawless machinery, disciplined soldiers, and decisive victories, while suppressing footage of malfunctioning equipment, exhausted troops, and the environmental toll on both people and landscape. This corporate shaping of memory ensured that the liberation narrative was commercially profitable, politically advantageous, and psychologically reassuring, cementing myths that would persist long after the frozen battlefields had been abandoned, and the survivors returned to a society struggling to reconcile the propaganda with their own lived experiences. Even soldiers themselves were compelled to participate in the construction of the myth, encouraged through medals, commendations, and media appearances to recount their experiences in ways that aligned with official narratives. Recollections of frostbite, exhaustion, friendly fire, and moral compromise were downplayed or omitted, replaced by stories of technological heroism, strategic brilliance, and unwavering patriotism. Veterans' voices that strayed from the sanctioned narrative were marginalized, labeled as disgruntled, mentally unstable, or revisionist, ensuring that the public memory remained consistent with the desired version of history. This erasure of nuance allowed the liberation of Anchorage to be celebrated as a clear and unambiguous victory, when in truth it had been a complex, morally ambiguous, and profoundly costly campaign where survival, endurance, and improvisation had dictated outcomes as much as strategy or technology. The long-term effects of these lies were profound, shaping the post-war understanding of the campaign and embedding a mythology that endured even as Alaska and the rest of the country moved toward the catastrophe of the Great War. Schools taught sanitized versions of the battles. Media celebrated power armor and strategic ingenuity, and corporations profited from the technological prestige of the campaign, while the human stories of suffering, moral compromise, and survival were consigned to whispers among veterans, classified reports, and the frozen remnants of Anchorage itself. By manipulating memory, controlling information, and suppressing inconvenient truths, the United States transformed what had been a harrowing struggle for survival into a story of clear-cut triumph, a narrative that served political, corporate, and psychological purposes, while obscuring the reality that liberation had been earned through immense suffering, improvisation, and moral ambiguity. In this way, the lies of liberation became as integral to Anchorage's legacy as the ice, artillery craters, and frozen streets themselves. A reminder that history is as much constructed as it is recorded, and that the stories we tell about war are often as revealing about ourselves as they are about the events we claim to describe. The veterans' return was a journey that carried no fanfare, no parades, and no immediate recognition, as the men and women who had endured the frozen crucible of Anchorage came home to a society unprepared to absorb their trauma, a nation still enthralled by sanitized narratives of liberation, and a world teetering on the edge of collapse, where the human cost of survival had been obscured by propaganda, politics, and corporate interests. Soldiers returned with bodies and minds permanently altered by frostbite, injury, and the relentless stress of months or years on the Northern Front. Yet the accolades and medals could not heal shattered nerves, severed friendships, or the moral scars etched by actions taken under orders in conditions that blurred the lines between duty and atrocity. Many veterans found themselves adrift in a society that demanded gratitude and hero worship, even as it failed to address the physical and psychological needs created by the campaign, leaving families and communities struggling to understand the profound changes imposed on those who had faced unrelenting combat, sub-zero extremes, and the existential threat of both enemy forces and the environment itself. The reintegration into civilian life was fraught with challenges. Employment was scarce for those with debilitating injuries. Housing shortages forced many into crowded or temporary quarters, and social support structures were overwhelmed or non-existent, while the mental health consequences of sustained exposure to trauma, loss, and moral compromise were largely ignored, leaving veterans isolated and struggling to articulate experiences that had been deliberately concealed from public discourse. Post-traumatic stress became a silent epidemic among returning troops, manifesting in insomnia, nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional detachment, and yet resources for care were minimal, stigmatized, or inaccessible. creating a gulf between the heroic image celebrated in propaganda and the painful reality of survival. Families often encountered difficulties reconnecting with their returning members, as soldiers found it impossible to reconcile the horrors they had endured with the sanitized version of the campaign they were expected to recount. Letters, holotapes, and official records painted victories in clean, triumphant strokes, while the veterans themselves bore witness to frozen graves, frostbitten comrades, and ethical compromises that haunted their memories. The return home also revealed economic and social fractures, exacerbated by years of total mobilization. Conscripts who had been absent from communities for extended periods found their jobs filled, their homes repurposed, and their social roles diminished, while veterans who attempted to advocate for themselves or their comrades were often met with bureaucratic indifference or hostility, their sacrifices minimized in favor of the enduring myth of victory. Unemployment, both literal and existential, plagued the returning soldiers, as industries that had thrived on wartime production contracted rapidly, leaving skilled technicians, power armor operators, and field engineers without work, their expertise tied to a war that had ended, yet whose memory remained politically useful. Veterans found themselves negotiating a society eager to celebrate sanitized heroism, but unwilling to contend with the lingering consequences of human and environmental destruction, and many turned to informal networks of comrades, veteran associations, and clandestine gatherings to find understanding, solidarity, and a measure of psychological relief. These networks became lifelines for soldiers grappling with memory, grief, and moral injury, offering shared narratives of endurance that countered the officially sanctioned versions of victory, and allowing veterans to bear witness to realities suppressed by the lies of liberation. Yet even within these spaces, the shadow of propaganda and societal expectation remained, influencing the stories told, the deeds emphasized, and the losses downplayed, creating an uneasy balance between authenticity and survival in a world eager to move past the horrors of Anchorage without truly confronting them. The betrayal experienced by many returning soldiers was compounded by the disconnect between their lived experiences and the public celebration of the campaign, as political leaders, corporations, and historians emphasized technological innovation, strategic brilliance, and patriotic heroism, while suppressing the human cost and ethical ambiguities that defined the Northern conflict. Veterans reported frustration, resentment, and alienation, recognizing that their sacrifices had been exploited to create narratives of national glory, while their own needs for care, recognition, and justice were largely ignored. The contrast between myth and reality became a source of bitterness as returning soldiers encountered a society eager to honor an idealized version of their service, but unwilling to acknowledge the personal toll, the psychological injuries, and the moral compromises required to achieve the so-called victory. Some veterans turned to advocacy, documenting their experiences, lobbying for compensation or medical care, and attempting to educate the public on the realities of Arctic warfare and total mobilization, but these efforts were frequently marginalized, censored, or co-opted into sanitized narratives, underscoring the systemic failure to reconcile the human cost of the campaign with the myth of liberation. In the aftermath of the campaign, the physical and psychological landscape of Anchorage and the broader United States bore the unmistakable imprint of its veterans' experiences. Frostbitten streets, abandoned fortifications, and scorched industrial zones were visible reminders of survival at enormous cost, while the memories carried by returning soldiers created a living record of endurance, suffering, and moral complexity that the state, media, and corporate entities largely sought to suppress or manipulate. Veterans' stories of frostbite, isolation, and relentless psychological pressure provided a counterpoint to the sanitized accounts of liberation, a testament to the endurance of human beings in conditions that strained body, mind, and conscience to their limits. Their return, while a physical act of movement from battlefield to homeland, represented an ongoing struggle to reconcile reality with narrative, trauma with societal expectation, and personal experience with national myth, highlighting the profound dissonance between the lived consequences of war and the constructed versions of victory that would dominate historical memory. In this sense, the veterans' return was as much a campaign as Operation Anchorage itself, a struggle to navigate a society shaped by propaganda, corporate interests, and political expediency, while carrying the invisible weight of sacrifices, horrors, and human endurance that history often refused to acknowledge, leaving survivors to bear the silent legacy of America's final Northern War. Anchorage and the Great War are bound together like two ends of the same detonating fuse, one igniting the other in a chain of desperation, escalation, and blindness to consequence. For while the world celebrated the so-called liberation of Alaska as America's final triumph, beneath the frozen soil and patriotic rhetoric lay the seeds of global annihilation. The Anchorage campaign did not end conflict. It mechanized it, industrialized it, and stripped it of restraint, transforming the United States and China into engines of total war that could no longer disengage, even as both nations teetered on economic collapse and environmental exhaustion. The victory at Anchorage was meant to secure the last oil reserves, but it instead accelerated the depletion of resources, as new technologies, power armor, fusion weaponry, autonomous combat platforms devoured the very energy they were designed to protect. Each breakthrough in military science widened the rift between survival and extinction, feeding an arms race that left diplomacy obsolete and morality irrelevant, a competition that transformed both superpowers into mirror images of one another, paranoid, starving, and willing to burn the world to preserve the illusion of dominance. The victory that was supposed to ensure peace instead destabilized the balance of power, as China's loss in Alaska ignited nationalist fury and desperation, and America's triumph hardened into arrogance, a belief that technological superiority could defy the limits of nature and humanity alike. In the months following Anchorage, the United States accelerated its militarization beyond anything seen before in human history, transforming entire regions into production zones for weapons that could end civilization with a single command. The Anchorage campaign's logistical demands had already strained the nation's infrastructure, but its perceived success justified even greater excesses: mass automation, resource annexations, and the prioritization of military spending over civilian welfare. Factories that had once produced tanks now turned to mass-producing robots. Research divisions that had developed portable power armor began experimenting with miniaturized nuclear reactors and fusion-based ordnance. The lessons of Anchorage, learned in blood and frost, were applied to the entire planet, and the same corporate giants, Robco, Poseidon Energy, Westtech, competed not for contracts of survival, but for the chance to weaponize the future itself. Meanwhile, China, humiliated and energy-starved, pursued parallel paths of desperation, covert operations, industrial espionage, and experimental bioweapons research, determined to reclaim parity by any means necessary. The arms race that had begun in the icy mountains of Alaska now stretched across continents and oceans, with each side seeking to outpace annihilation by creating ever more devastating tools of war. The legacy of Anchorage thus became a doctrine, a belief that technological superiority was not only protection, but destiny. And this philosophy pervaded every level of American life. The military-industrial complex became indistinguishable from government. Corporations gained authority over policy, and propaganda elevated innovation into a moral imperative. Citizens were told that the sacrifices in Alaska had secured freedom, and that the continuation of the war economy was the price of peace, creating a society locked in perpetual mobilization, even after the guns had fallen silent. As resources dwindled, the rhetoric of national survival became justification for annexation and exploitation, with the United States tightening its grip on Canada and turning domestic industries into extensions of the war machine. Civilian dissent was quietly silenced, rationing became normalized, and the line between wartime necessity and peacetime oppression dissolved, leaving a nation perpetually preparing for a war it had already won and could no longer stop fighting. Anchorage had proven that war could be industrially sustained, but it also revealed that once sustained, it could never truly be ended. The campaign also accelerated scientific developments that would directly contribute to the Great War's catastrophic scale. Power armor research, once a tactical innovation, evolved into mass-produced exoskeletons capable of turning a single soldier into a walking tank. Laser and plasma weaponry moved from prototype to battlefield standard, and the study of miniaturized nuclear technology, initially for power generation, was repurposed for portable weapon systems. West Tech's development of the forced evolutionary virus, born from military-funded genetics programs during the resource wars, was one of many examples of how Anchorage's technological imperatives mutated into apocalyptic science. Each breakthrough came with promises of safety and deterrence, but each brought humanity closer to the brink. The same laboratories that had built the T-51B power armor would, years later, build the bombs that fell on the 23rd of October 2077, and the same scientists who had once celebrated the liberation of Anchorage would watch the world burn beneath mushroom clouds of their own design. For all its tactical success, Anchorage revealed the futility of victory in a world that no longer understood peace. It taught superpowers that any problem could be solved through escalation, that dominance equaled security, and that morality was an obstacle to progress. The propaganda that had once celebrated liberation now became a template for total control, teaching governments that populations could be pacified through myth, that the horrors of war could be erased by spectacle, and that the future could be owned by those who manufactured its narrative. When the Great War came, it was not the sudden eruption of chaos, but the inevitable conclusion of a system that had forgotten restraint, a system that had turned survival into an industry and death into policy. The frozen victories of Anchorage melted into the firestorms of 2077, and the soldiers who had fought for oil and survival became the ghosts who watched their civilization vanish in the heat of its own making. Even centuries later, in the radioactive silence of the post-apocalyptic wasteland, the ghosts of Anchorage linger. The simulation constructed by the pre-war government to commemorate the campaign would preserve its myths, its triumphs, and its lies, allowing future generations to relive the victory without ever confronting the cost. The Great War may have obliterated the nations that fought it, but it did not erase the legacy of the ideals that created it. the belief in domination, the worship of technology, and the blindness to consequence. Anchorage and the Great War are inseparable, not as cause and effect, but as reflections of the same human flaw. The inability to stop fighting long after the reasons for war have vanished. In that frozen battlefield, humanity's fate was sealed, not with the fall of bombs, but with the first drop of blood spilled for oil, the first factory retooled for war, and the first lie told to justify the cost. The simulation was never meant to preserve history. It was designed to control it. A digital echo of war constructed in a world desperate to remember victory while forgetting the truth, a machine-built myth where blood, frost, and sacrifice could be replayed endlessly without consequence. Long after the last survivors of Anchorage had grown old, long after the soldiers' testimonies had been buried beneath state secrecy and propaganda, Vault-Tec and the US military joined forces to ensure that the Anchorage campaign would never fade from memory, or more precisely, that it would only ever be remembered one way. The Anchorage reclamation simulation was both monument and instrument, a virtual warscape that distilled chaos into order, moral ambiguity into righteousness, and tragedy into spectacle. It was not a documentary. It was indoctrination rendered in code, a patriotic hallucination that allowed soldiers, citizens, and later even corporate clients to relive their liberation as pure, unquestioned triumph. Vault-Tec, whose vaults were marketed as shelters for the elite of the pre-war world, engineered the simulation as part of a broader psychological experiment in control, testing how memory, morality, and identity could be manipulated through sensory immersion, how soldiers could be conditioned, and how history itself could be rewritten in the minds of those who believed they were simply remembering. The simulation was constructed with astonishing detail, merging classified military data, topographical scans, and first-hand combat recordings to recreate the frozen battlefield with unnerving authenticity. Every ridge, every bunker, every frost-bitten corpse rendered in digital precision, while the participant, wired into neural feedback systems, was made to feel the cold, the recoil, the terror, the exhilaration. It was war without death, a resurrection of history, stripped of decay and contradiction, and yet it carried a hidden purpose: behavioral reinforcement. Officially, it was designed to train soldiers by immersing them in a virtual replication of the Anchorage campaign, allowing for the study of tactical decisions, leadership, and combat effectiveness. In truth, it was a tool to measure obedience, to test the limits of loyalty under simulated duress, and to reframe war as a controllable, repeatable experience, an illusion where victory was inevitable and the cost invisible. The boundaries between memory and simulation blurred. Veterans were invited to consult on the project, only to find their own recollections corrected by algorithms that insisted on the state's version of events. Some protested, insisting the cold had been harsher, the battles messier, the death toll higher. The program corrected them. It always corrected them. Vault-Tec's involvement ensured that the simulation was not merely military training, it was psychological conditioning. The company's Vault experiments, infamous in later centuries for their cruelty and moral corruption, found an early expression here, in the idea that human perception could be reprogrammed for ideological stability. The Anchorage simulation tested not only combat readiness, but moral elasticity. Participants could commit atrocities without consequence, experience death without dying, and emerge believing they had acted heroically. For military strategists, it was a triumph. For historians, a nightmare. The line between memory and propaganda was erased. replaced by digital perfection. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the simulation endured, sealed within a secure chamber beneath Washington, D.C., its machinery humming through the centuries, preserving the last pre-war fantasy of order in a world that had fallen into chaos. Centuries later, scavengers and soldiers from a shattered civilization would discover the Anchorage simulation intact, its interface untouched by time, its cold logic waiting to ensnare new minds. To them, it was a relic of myth, a fragment of the old world's glory, a window into a time when men fought for nations and honor instead of survival and scrap. But to those who entered it, as the lone wanderer once did in the ruins beneath the outcast outpost, it was something far more insidious, a time capsule of propaganda masquerading as heroism. Inside, the war replayed endlessly, frozen in the moment of victory, unblemished by doubt or death. The participant became a ghost inhabiting the skin of soldiers long dead, fighting battles long decided, immersed in a world where war was pure and victory clean. The simulation rewarded obedience, punished hesitation, and erased fear, crafting perfect soldiers from imperfect survivors. In that virtual anchorage, humanity's final war became an endless loop of manufactured triumph, a cruel parody of the real world outside, where the consequences of that same war had burned the earth to ash. Even in the post-apocalyptic age, the simulation's influence lingered. The Outcasts, and later the Brotherhood of Steel, saw it not merely as a relic, but as a resource, a vault of pre-war technology and tactical data that could restore their edge in the wasteland. Yet few recognized the deeper horror embedded in its circuits, that the program was not designed to teach truth, but to erase it. The participants who completed the simulation emerged, changed, conditioned, often speaking of clarity, purpose, and victory, unaware that they had been subtly rewritten to believe in the righteousness of a war whose lies had birthed the apocalypse. The Anchorage simulation thus became both a monument to humanity's greatest technological achievement and its greatest moral failure, an artifact of a species that could recreate its own destruction and call it progress. The cold digital snow fell eternally within that chamber, untouched by time, by guilt, by truth, forever replaying the liberation of Anchorage, forever teaching that war was noble, that obedience was valor, and that history was whatever the victor chose to remember. The legacy of Anchorage is not written in the snow, nor in the steel of power armor, or the slogans of propaganda. It endures in the echoes of a civilization that destroyed itself, chasing the illusion of victory. Long after the frozen tundra thawed beneath radioactive skies, long after the flags that once claimed Alaska rotted into dust, the memory of the Anchorage campaign lived on, refracted through myth, simulation, and the scattered relics of a world that mistook conquest for survival. The battle that was once hailed as America's final triumph became something else entirely, a parable of human hubris, a monument to the lies we tell ourselves about war, progress, and destiny. In the ruins of the post-Great War world, the name Anchorage still carried weight, invoked by scavengers as a symbol of lost technology, by soldiers as a memory of glory, and by historians, if any still remained, as the moment when humanity crossed the threshold from survival into self-destruction. It was here that the myth of American exceptionalism reached its zenith, where technology eclipsed morality, and where the dream of endless progress froze solid beneath the eternal northern ice. Centuries later, the frozen battlefield would become a graveyard of myths. The power armor shells that once symbolized invincibility lay entombed in drifts of permafrost, their occupants long gone, their servos silent. The propaganda that had once painted Anchorage as liberation faded into static on decaying holotapes, while the few who still sought its ruins did so not for patriotism, but for salvage, metal, circuitry, fusion cores. Yet the ghosts of that war persisted, not as spirits, but as ideas. The belief that strength could erase guilt, that technology could outpace consequence, that the past could be rewritten through simulation. Even in the wasteland, where nations no longer existed and survival had replaced ideology, the same logic endured in new forms. Brotherhood paladins in gleaming armor, enclave agents reviving the rhetoric of the old world, scavengers fighting over relics of power without understanding the cost that once forged them. The Anchorage campaign had not ended with victory. It had metastasized, its philosophy surviving the fall of every government that once believed in it. The war had outlived its soldiers, its cause, and its civilization, because its legacy was not the liberation of Alaska, it was the normalization of endless conflict. In every generation that followed, the shadow of Anchorage lingered. The Brotherhood of Steel, born from the ashes of the military-industrial complex that had once supplied the Northern Front, carried with it the same duality that had defined that campaign: the pursuit of knowledge as salvation and its inevitable corruption into domination. To them, Anchorage was a lesson not in loss, but in reverence for technology, a belief that the tools of the old world were sacred, that mastery over machines could restore the order lost to nuclear fire. Yet they, too, became prisoners of that same myth, mistaking preservation for purity, inheritance for purpose. The Enclave, in turn, used Anchorage's legacy as justification for tyranny, claiming to be the rightful heirs of a nation that had once stood victorious against its enemies, perpetuating the same ideology that had ensured its own destruction. The wasteland itself became a living monument to Anchorage's failure, a world still fighting over resources, still ruled by fear, still chasing the illusion that power brings safety. And then there were the vaults, those subterranean tombs of humanity's arrogance, many of which owed their very existence to the paranoia born from Anchorage. The resource wars, fueled by the same desperation that had driven soldiers to die in frozen trenches, created the conditions for Vault-Tech's rise, its promise of safety echoing the same propaganda that had once promised victory. The Vault-Tech scientists who built the Anchorage simulation carried forward not only the technology of the campaign, but its philosophy that humanity could be controlled, perfected, and preserved through manipulation, that the chaos of reality could be replaced by the order of illusion. Inside their experiments, entire generations were subjected to the same moral blindness that had defined the pre-war world, reenacting its errors in microcosm, unable to escape the gravitational pull of the same mistakes. In that sense, every vault dweller who emerged, blinking into the wasteland, was not just a survivor of nuclear fire, they were a descendant of Anchorage, inheriting the consequences of a war fought over resources, lies, and the human refusal to learn. In the centuries after the Great War, the simulation remained buried, the frozen battlefield long melted, yet Anchorage's influence stretched across time like a fracture in the soul of civilization. In the Mojave, the NCR marched east under banners of expansion and order, repeating the language of liberation. In the capital wasteland, the Brotherhood continued to salvage the relics of the old war machine, and in the Commonwealth, scientists pursued technologies that blurred the line between man and machine. Each was a mirror of Anchorage, unaware or unwilling to see it, a repetition of the same cycle of ambition and ruin, played out beneath the scorched sky instead of the northern aurora. The legacy of Anchorage, therefore, is not confined to history. It is a living memory embedded in the DNA of the post-apocalyptic world, a reminder that humanity's greatest triumphs often plant the seeds of its own annihilation. In the end, the Anchorage campaign was never about Alaska. It was about a civilization testing the limits of its morality, its technology, and its soul, and failing all three. The snow melted, the ice cracked, and the world burned, but the ideas that caused it all endured. In every outpost rebuilt, every weapon rediscovered, every ideology reborn, the echoes of Anchorage whisper, war never changes. The frozen battlefields may be gone, the soldiers' bones buried beneath centuries of dust and frost, yet their struggle, its glory, and its guilt lives on, encoded in every survivor who still believes that the next war will be different. And so the circle closes. The same frostbitten winds that once howled through the Alaskan mountains now sweep across a dead world, carrying with them the last truth of humanity's final war, that victory was never liberation, only the beginning of the end.